Yes, because very recently there was a report from Ernst & Young that actually said that the cost of doing business is still very high in Nigeria, by 131. So yes, the issue of addressing the issues of infrastructure should definitely help. But now let's go outside of Nigeria. Let's look at the Africa context, because that is what they're going to be using or basing most of the discussions on at this meeting. What are the growth prospects for Africa? Let's start with that. Let's look at the challenges that might, first of all, affect the growth prospects in Africa. Mr. Begun, if you could.
Okay, well, the challenges that will affect the growth prospects in Africa are still what I call the usual things that have kept Africa behind, Again, it still goes back to what we are just discussing now. If you look at the whole of Africa, I mean, let's exclude South Africa, because South Africa had the opportunity of being developed. Every other country is just more like struggling. Each one of them, they don't have GDPs that are meaningful, I'm sorry to say. The capacity they have is low. The infrastructure is not there. But one thing I think we have in Africa is that we have the human resource. And then with the education level, like in Nigeria, we have a lot of educated folks who have people who have capable hands, but they are not deployed well. So if we have these investments coming, it will be a way to mop up the youth, from what I call vices into productive activity. So that will generate employment, and that seems to be why the finance minister chose that thing, inclusive growth, creating employment opportunity, because that is a potential danger in the political scene. Because when these young boys and girls leave school, year 1, year 2, year 3, no job. They're like the devil. They will make this workshop in the hands of the elder ones. So if we don't have a way of channeling these resources into productive, they will necessarily do things that are not productive and harmful to the continent.
But if you notice, in the last couple of years, in Africa particularly, the strength of the small and medium enterprises has actually increased. It has actually grown. But it's still not been harnessed as it should be. And which is the reason why we still have, the growing challenge of unemployment. And so how can, now that we have this on the forefront, now that we're having these discussions here at the World Economic Forum Africa meeting, how can we begin to position ourselves in such a way that, because we have about 17 million small and medium scale enterprises here in Nigeria. And so how can we begin to harness, this rather ferocious army to combat the issue of unemployment?
Okay, let me come in from this angle. Like I always say, that a continent or a nation that sees job creation as a favor done to its youth is a country or a continent that does not understand productivity. Now, the energy in the younger generation is actually what you need to drive productivity. Now, it's easier to spend money. It's more difficult to actually make money. Now, for you to grow the SMEs, we have to go back to the basics. And what are the basics? What are the issues that they have been having, which has, it's been, everybody have said it, the World Bank, UN, everybody says the same thing. Access to finance. Now, in countries that we look up to, especially, example like the United States, in far back 1850 something, there was a legislation to actually support venture capital. Now, in our own case, because you can't talk about getting loans without you talking about the initial capital, the initial equity that you need before you get to where loans will come to you. Now, we have to solve the basic problem, which is the first issue, which is having a venture capital system that works, having angel funds. Now, because nowadays, what we do now, people just rely on family members or friends to actually get that initial capital.
No, I disagree with you. We've seen that there are various agencies that do that. The Bank of Industry, for instance, where
Bank of Industry, for example. Yeah, you've come to Bank of Industry. Bank of Industry can only fund 70% of your equipment costs. So that means you have a 30% of the equipment cost to contribute as an individual. You also have to have 30% of the total project cost to contribute.
So in other words, what you're saying that maybe, for instance, that line that they're taking right now, the federal government is taking right now, isn't what it should be taking at the moment. Rather, they should give a more robust,
yes, and more holistic. They need to look at it properly. The central bank had something, a SMEs. No, that particular thing was actually born out of the bankers committee agreed on, putting in 10% of their net earnings into supporting equity, bringing it as equity to support SMEs. Now, for me, I would have thought that any right-thinking person would actually turn that thing into a legislation, so that with that you'll be able to jumpstart a venture capital automatically, because those funds, because they are time, you must actually invest those funds. And then number two, what are the things that what are the issues we're having in Nigeria? It's not corruption. Why? Because you have idle funds. They say the idle mind is a devil's workshop. I say that idle funds is actually the devil itself. So until you have monies working, you cannot actually take this country from where it is to the level where it needs to get to.
Even with the discussions that are ongoing at the moment, because you see, it's not as if they're totally oblivious of the fact that there is corruption in the system, and it's not as if they're totally oblivious of the fact that these funds are there and lying idle.
Yes.
And so discussions have actually been ongoing as regards how best, to channel these funds, and sometimes, for want of better word to use, it might be misplaced.
People are the greatest resource to manage, and that's what. See, all these funds, we are not bereft of ideas in this country. On the ground, we are not bereft of what to do. Look at that fund he mentioned. There was a lot of money in it, but it's in implementation as usual. In implementation, you put people there. They now start looking after themselves rather than looking after the country. They start doing things that are not, ethical, so to say, and that ties into the corruption. So we need to, I still go back to what he used, we need to put our house in order. Our house needs to be in order. It's good to restart everything, because to me, I'm just looking at this as maybe restarting or re-energizing ourselves and doing a lot of refocusing. Some of these ideas had come earlier on, in my days, even when I was about leaving university. But how far has the implementation and success been? We've put people who are supposed to be responsible, and they ended up being irresponsible. And they've put, the nation at array, in disarray. So really and truly, I think it's a combination of things. We need to find responsible people to run, some of these ideas, because people will be entrusted with money, large funds of money, and then the ideas are already there. We are not bereft of ideas in this country. We are very well educated people. We have very intelligent personnel, and we have the resources to make it work.
So when we come back after this quick break for us to catch our breath, we'll look at some of these models that we can use to make,
to make things work, to make things happen. Thank you very much.
You're still watching Business Morning on Channels Television, and we're broadcasting live from the nation's capital, Abuja, where the 24th edition of the World Economic Forum Africa meeting has officially started. Well, officially and unofficially as well. But Business Morning returns in just a moment. Please join us again.